So thank you for coming out for day 3 of Rabbi Dr. Arnson. I know that days 1 and 2 have been incredible, and I know we're all looking forward to day 3. But before we start, I would like to thank again the people who sponsored this weekend. The Eggers, the Falcons, and the Borsets. Yes. So thank you. I also just want to take 1 minute and thank Rabbi Mero, who really pushed to have this weekend. And she has a relationship with Rabbi Arnson and wanted Rabbi Arnson here. And to her credit, he's here, and we have all had an incredible weekend. So thank you, Rabbi Mero. And I don't think I left anything else out, did I? If I did, you'll do it.
We're gonna have a end of year great celebration to celebrate Heidi, right? Thank you. Right, are we, Heidi? Also, I want to thank Kiddush crew and Suzanne. So if you're thank them. Lunch was lovely yesterday, and better when Kiddush crew does it, right? Also, let's thank Joel, because Joel also wanted to have an art center. And for all of the making sure everything got taken care of this weekend. Avi's here. Thanks, Avi, for all of your davening. Avi's gonna have to walk out in the middle, not because he wants to, but he has to teach our 6th graders how to read Torah, right? Just 1 or 2 announcements. If you were not able to come to our session on Thursday night, the Mercer County Board of Rabbis, 4 synagogues in Mercer County, are doing an Israel Solidarity Mission November 1st to 9th. So it's us, Beth El, Adif, and Beth Chaim. One of the clergy, we think, from each shul will be going, and hopefully members. It's a great itinerary. Afterwards, if you'd like to see the itinerary, I have copies of it. Also, my class that meets on Tuesday nights is not meeting this week, but the week after and the week after, by your request, is Pesach, and you're going to be studying text on Passover, because as the class will tell you, it's not frontal, it's a discussion class. Without any further ado, it's an honor to be able to learn from such an incredible teacher. Someone said how lucky we are that the next generation of rabbis is being taught by you. So, Rabbi Arnson. If you don't have, does anyone not have a text?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. So before I start the teaching part, I just want to also say my thanks. I travel a fair amount. I speak at different congregations. And one of the things I was mentioning to your president yesterday is that if I lived here, I would be a member here. We have a wonderful community, and I've enjoyed being with you. You have been so hospitable and made me feel completely at home. So thank you to you and your leadership and your wonderful clergy. It has been a really lovely weekend. I hope you have enjoyed it as well. About 10 years ago, I decided that as a rabbi, I needed to have read the whole Talmud. And you can do that if you read a page a day for 8.5 years. No days off. You have to read a page on Shabbat, you have to read a page on Yom Kippur, you have to read a page, no breaks. But if you do that, you can cover the entire Talmud, cover to cover to cover to cover to cover. And the nice thing about doing that is that you discover things that no one ever taught you that speak to you. And this is one of my favorite stories in the Talmud. And I would never have found it had I not read the whole thing. So a little background about this story. I want to remind you that the Talmud is, in a sense, the vacuum cleaner of ancient Israel's libraries. Everything that ancient Israel wrote got sucked up into the Talmud. Legends and myths and laws and stories and philosophy and history and personalities and agriculture, everything finds its place in the Talmud. And the Talmud was, for most of its history, not a popular book. It was a book used by scholars to train young scholars. And so as we're reading this, I want you to be thinking, somebody put this story in the Talmud because they wanted young rabbinical scholars to read this story. They felt that young rabbis needed to see this story. The other thing I want to say by way of preparation is that the Talmud is a very literary book. So I'm going to teach this story as literature, which is to say, it is my assumption that no actual Alexander was involved in the making of this story. In the ancient world, Alexander was the equivalent of Napoleon Bonaparte in his generation, the equivalent of FDR in his. Alexander was everybody's favorite Gentile. And so he gets used in this story as a foil to make the point that the narrator wants to make. But don't get tripped up by did this actually happen or not. This is an act of rabbinic fantasy, which also makes the story more incredible. So we're going to just jump right in and we're going to read it like rabbis, which is we're going to talk our way through it. Okay, and this is going to be more interactive than my previous presentation, so I'm going to need you to, when I ask a question, I'm not being rhetorical, I'm really asking for you to say something. Okay?
Yes.
Just practicing here. All right, so the story starts. I'm going to read it in the English, but you have the original in case you want to follow along. I understand there are some people here who are regular Talmud scholars. Alexander of Macedon put 10 questions to the elders of the South country, that is to say the Negev. So given that this is literature, the fact that they introduce him as Alexander of Macedon, what does that tell us? Well, there are other Alexanders, so this is singling him out. What's the choice of singling him out as of Macedon? There are a lot of ways they could have introduced him. What does of Macedon do?
Well, it's Greek.
Well, okay, so one is it's telling us he's Greek. That's actually debated. People from real Greece don't think that Macedon is Greece in the same way that those of us from San Francisco do not think that people from the peninsula live in the San Francisco Bay Area.
I know it doesn't say Alexander is great, just as Alexander of Macedon.
Correct, so he's not the great. So I want to say a word about the great in Western tradition. To get the title the great, you have to either take land that doesn't belong to you or kill people who are otherwise innocent. So Herod the Great, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, Frederick the Great, they are all butchers, all of them. But that's not what it takes to be great in the Jewish tradition. And so Alex, alas, is not great by our standards. But now I want to dig deep. So they locate him by not his job. They don't call him king or emperor. They tell you where he's from. What does that indicate about what this story is going to be about? It's going to be about what does it mean to be from a place. Right? And the rabbis want to make a point here about what it means to be grounded, what it means to come from somewhere. And the ultimate symbol of a guy who doesn't have a place is Alexander. He spends his whole life trying to conquer other people's places. What was he looking for? What was he lacking that he thought he could find? The legend is told of Alexander that when he got to the Ganges River, and apparently his vision wasn't very good because he thought the world ended there, he cried because there were no more worlds to conquer. Right? So this is a man who the rabbis are seeing as someone who is profoundly unaware of what it means to be of somewhere. And of course, you know, the rabbis are the opposite because they get introduced as Ziknei HaNegev, the elders of a place, the Negev, right? So these rabbis are deeply rooted in the land of Israel, not only in the land of Israel, but in a part of the land of Israel, right? The Negev is who they are. And one other contrast I want you to notice, Alexander has no place, but he has a personal. Someone raise their hand and tell me why. Why do we not know the Negev elder's name? Yes. It's not important, right? Because to be a rabbi, to be a Jewish sage, is to be part of a team. You are just one welling up of a tradition. And what matters is the tradition, right? What matters is our connection to God. So Alexander has spent a life in service of his own ego, his own personal identity, and the rabbis have spent a whole life being part of a collective enterprise. Right? And that's all of that encapsulated in that one sentence. Is that amazing? Right? Look at how much the narrator has already foreshadowed. The entire unfolding is going to be an unpacking of that. What does it mean to be in a place? What does it mean to care about your own personal identity? What does it mean to be part of a group? Yes.
But on the other hand, in thousands of places, the Talmud refers to individual rabbis dating each other.
Yes.
How do you reconcile those two ideas?
So I love that. And the comment is, in other places, the Talmud mentions people by name, and is one of the great things about. I am blessed. It is one of the great things about rabbinic literature is that unlike the Bible, you get to know whose opinion you're arguing with, right? So here's what I want to tell you about the key to reading rabbinic literature. You cannot generalize. Rabbinic literature, like rabbinic sermons, are always to make a specific point. This week, I want to get up and I want to tell you, because of what happened this week, that you need to submit your own ego to the group. Next week, when I'm worried that you are treating yourself like a doormat and you're not honoring yourself, I'm going to give you a sermon about how important it is to assert your own identity over that of the group. And you're going to say, wait, last week, you said, I'll say, yeah, because last week I had a different point to make, right? Sermons are always contextual, right? This isn't abstract, timeless philosophy. This is how do you live life. And sometimes you need to be told one thing, and sometimes you need to be told the opposite. This is a story about being grounded and part of a group.
So many times the rabbis will say, Rabbi so-and-so said in the name of Rabbi so-and-so.
Yes,
So they're emphasizing that they're part of this community, part of this process.
absolutely. Rabbinic naming.
It's not for their own glory. that
Well,
they're-
not only is it not part of their own glory, but rabbis named in the Talmud, we don't know anything about them except for what they said. Right? Sometimes we know they have kids, but that we know that only because the kids are part of the story. Thank you very much, Rabbi. Right, so yes, rabbinic naming is part of rooting them in a tradition, and if you have an oral tradition, then it's only as strong as your ability to remember who told it to you. Right, so it becomes really important. It's the rabbinic equivalent of footnotes. All right, can we move on? Okay. So he asked, which is further, from heaven to earth or from east to west? And they replied from east to west. The proof is that when the sun is in the east, all can look at it. And when it's in the west, all can look at it. But when the sun is in the middle of the sky, no one can look at it. Now, at this point, you're thinking, what in the world is he teaching us here? But I want to explain this. The question that they're asking is, when the sun is on the horizon, is it closer or further than when it's in the midday sky? The image that the rabbis had, like all the ancients, is that the earth is a flat dish and the sun circles it every day. So is this to this a greater distance than here to there? All got the question? How do they answer that? What's their answer? They say that what's further is from here to here. How do they know that? They offer a piece of evidence. What's the evidence? When you look at the sun in the midday, what do you know about it? It's too bright. You can look at it on the horizon, but you can't look at it in the middle of the day. And so notice the rabbis are being good scientists. They're interpreting the data as best they can, but they watch nature, right? It is true that the sun on the horizon, you can look at longer than the sun in the middle of the day. And think about it, someone takes a flashlight and they shine it at you from across the room, you can look at it. But if they put it right in front of your face, you're gonna stop seeing anything, right? So they're using that to say it's obvious that the sun, when it's here, is closer to us than when it's there. Now, I just want to point out to you, as members of the 21st century, that the data is correct, the interpretation is wrong. Right, so for those of you who are curious in the score, the reason you can look at it on the horizon is because, think about it, the earth is curved, so you have more atmosphere shielding you when you're looking that way than when you look directly and you have less atmosphere. That's why the sun is brighter in the middle of the day, but the fact that they noticed that is correct. So they gave him an answer, and they gave him an answer based on logic, which is very important. And then the sages say to each other, now that there's no longer a Gentile listening in, they say to each other, yeah, but we know that it actually is the same distance. And how do we know that? Because there's a pasuk, there's a verse. From as far as the east is from the west, so far has God removed transgressions from us. This is telling us that it's equidistant. Now, what I want to say to you is, why didn't they quote that to Alexander? If they have a pasuk, why not give it to him? Yeah.
Heaven means different things in the two cases. To Alexander, it was apparent that he was not talking about God. When they talk about heaven to each other, they're referring to God.
Maybe, I don't think so. I think here they're actually referring to the sky, but I want to just, wait. If a missionary comes to your house and tells you you have to believe in Jesus and quotes a verse from Luke, does that persuade you?
No.
No. Who would be persuaded by a verse from Luke? A Christian. You can only quote scripture authoritatively to someone who thinks your scripture is authoritative. Alexander, among his many other flaws, isn't Jewish. So what does he care that there's a verse in Tehillim? Like, it doesn't mean anything. But notice that if you're on the inside, when it comes to the weight of logic and experience, or the weight of a biblical verse, which has priority for the rabbis? The verse, right? Who are you going to believe? You're going to believe God or your own lying eyes? Right? So here's an important principle of dialogue. When you talk to people outside of your own community, you need to use universal tools like logic to be able to do that. There's no such thing as Japanese physics, California physics, New Jersey, like there's just physics. Because the logic and the rules are transcultural in important ways. That is not to say that individual physicists are not influenced by their own culture, They remain a last human. But there has to, but if you speak to someone who's in your group, then you can go right to the cultural roots of knowledge, and that can preempt the other stuff. So that's what they're doing here. When they talk to each other, they're gonna tell each other this fact. So now though, they have a problem. If in fact the Tanakh establishes that it is equidistant, that it's from here to here is no greater than from here to here, then they're stuck with the fact that it's still brighter in the middle of the day. So why is that? If it's the same distance, why does the sun appear differently? And here I just want to hold you to their answer. Look at this. If one of the distances is greater, the text shouldn't write that both are the same. Why is the reason that you can't look at the sun in the middle of the sky? Because it's absolutely clear and nothing obstructs the view. That's actually right. That is the reason. So I just want to point out to you, this document that is 2,500 years old nailed the science. Right? We moderns assume that we are privileged over our ancestors, and in some technological ways we are. But in terms of knowledge and wisdom, I think we have yet to come anywhere close to what our ancestors were able to dope out about the meaning of life and being in the world.
This was done in summertime, because in winter it would be different.
In winter, everything would be different. It's also done in the Middle East. This is happening in Babel, probably. So notice it's a story from sages in Babel, in Babylon, imagining Eretz Yisrael. Right? There's no actual Negev in the making of this story either. So then he goes on. Were heavens created first or earth? And that they reply, the heavens were created first. As it says, in the beginning, God created heaven and then earth. Now I want to ask you a question. I just established that Alexander is not Jewish, so you have to use logic. Why did they quote a pasuk to answer that question?
About your question, that's what I wanted to say before. It's not just that they bring the pasuk because among themselves they know the sources. It's also showing to this Alexander, to the Gentile, that they have an extra power using their own sources. It's not just the empirical proof, it's also our knowledge, our sources that
Correct. So
reinforce it.
you're right. This story is designed to tell us that we have an extra source of knowledge. But notice again, it's not really Alexander who's being told this, it's the rabbinical students who are listening into this story, right? It's saying to them in a stage whisper, hey, you have this secret weapon, you have Tanakh, so you can rely on that. But what I want to get to here is, why are they didn't quote a pasuk before, why are they quoting a pasuk now? Yeah.
Because Greeks had their own mythology, and perhaps in Greek mythology, one was created before the other.
But why not then quote Greek mythology? If they're trying to persuade Alexander, what they're doing is
But
telling him.
just give the same answer.
So let me ask you a different question. What evidence existed in the ancient world for whether the earth was created first or not? What empirical evidence could they have relied on? That is correct, none. We are among the first generations of people for whom there is empirical evidence about how the universe began. And you cannot overstate how important a difference that is from every previous generation. 100 years ago, people thought there was one galaxy. We now know there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. We know that because we have evidence. We have evidence about how the universe is expanding. They didn't have that evidence. So previous generations, meaning as recently as 100 years ago, all they had was logic. All they could do was sit and think about it, and they could speculate, and they could come up with possible coherent explanations. In that world, the pasuk is as good a piece of evidence as anything. So when there is actual facts, they give Alexander the facts. But when they don't, they give him a pasuk because there isn't anything else to tell you that. Right? So they're relying on Genesis as one's created first. So he then says, was light created first or darkness? And they tell him that can't be solved. Now, let me ask you, is there in fact a biblical verse that might be used to address the question of whether light was created first? The answer is yes, there is. So why don't they give it to him?
Because it's Jewish.
I think because there's a problem, that this was Alexander the Great, and he was, he was great. You can't quote the higher authority, Hashem, to him, because that goes against his belief system. So you have to use non-denominational logic, which is part of his world, to get into his brain and give answers, and not quote a higher authority that you believe in, because that goes against his whole worldview.
Okay, so in your take on this story, they're being respectful of Alexander and of his perspectives. You're gonna see they want to burn him every step of the way. This is not interfaith dialogue the way we know it. This is a story to rabbinical students to show them that Alex is a jackass, right? So I want to offer you a different perspective. When they thought it was an abstract, innocent question, then they answered it. But Alexander is about to launch a symposium with them, right? Greeks love abstract, philosophical, metaphysical debate. They love it. They make dinners out of it, right? The Seder coming up soon is a Jewish symposium, right? Greek free men used to lay on couches and they would have their dinner brought on a round table with a round plate. That should sound very Passover-like to you, right? And then they would have, the theme of the night would be, was earth created first or heaven? And they would spend the evening debating that, right? That was before they had Netflix. There wasn't a lot to do in Athens. So Jews, however, the rabbis prohibit abstract metaphysics. Right? There's a wonderful rabbinic teaching. Why was the universe created with a bet? Right? Bereshit bara Elohim. Why? Because you're prohibited to think about what's above. You're prohibited to think about what was before. You're prohibited to think about what was beneath. You're just allowed to move forward. Right? The rabbis don't want you to engage in abstract metaphysics because they are aware of the limits of human reason and of human arrogance, limitlessness. So what they want you to do is just focus on living a better life. Just concentrate on mitzvot and compassion and justice. That's enough. So the minute they see that Alex is trying to move them into a symposium, they shut down the conversation. Not gonna go there. So he keeps trying though. They thought to themselves, perhaps he'll ask what's above, what's below, what's before, and in that case, they should have answered the first question. But they didn't think at the time that it was a symposium. We're on the second page now. So now he shifts. More practical questions. He asks them, who is called wise? Do you know a rabbinic line that answers that question? Who is wise? Ezehu Hacham? How would it fit in that sentence? Pardon me? One who is happy in their portion? Okay. Right? So they give him a different answer. It turns out there's two places in the Mishnah where this question is addressed. Right? And they give him the other one. Well, anyone who knows what's about to happen. Does Alexander know what's about to happen?
No.
No. Right? So this is a way of saying to him, well, I don't know who is wise, but you're not. This is a rabbinic insult to Alexander. Right? And then he asks another one, Ezehu Gibor, who is great? And they answer that with, right? By the way, their answer to the second question comes from the answer to the first question that they did not give, which proves that they knew what the other answer would have been, but they didn't want to compliment him in any way, right? So instead, they used a different, less known answer, and now they say one who subdues his evil passions. Why are they giving that answer to him? Because he's made a career out of indulging his evil passions. Right? The man hasn't seen a passion he hasn't given into. Want to conquer the world? Sure. Want to have sex with your horse? Go for it. Right? Alex is the king of give in to your passions. So telling him who is mighty, what are they saying to him about him being mighty? You're a weakling. You don't have the ability to say no to anything. Right? So another insult. So then he says, who's rich? Ezehu Ashir. What answer is he expecting?
Money.
You are, you own everything. Right? He's the richest Greek before Aristotle Onassis. Right? And what answer do they give him? Sameach b'chelko, who's content, because he's made a life of not being content. Right? So they're telling him, you're not wise, you're not powerful, you're not any of these things. And then he said, what should a person do to thrive, to live? And they say, let him mortify himself. Right? And what should he do to mortify himself? Let him keep himself alive. Right? All of these are rabbinic insults to the greatest Gentile in the world. Right? And this is being directed to the rabbinical student reading the story. Don't look at Alexander and feel jealous. Alexander lived a shell of a life. Right? He spent his whole life pursuing a happiness that was always beyond the horizon, never attainable. If you give yourself to that life, if you give yourself to the life of ego, you will not have a contented day in your life. Yes.
What does it mean to mortify yourself?
It means that latest, you will not find happiness in a new Louis Vuitton bag. Right? If you learn that joy is to be found in experience, in relationship, not in acquisition, mortify yourself in that way. You don't need the extra donut. You're not going to be happy after you eat the cake. You don't need that extra drink. For happiness, why don't you pick up the phone and call a friend? Right? That's what he's saying. Mortify yourself. Don't give in to your carnal desires. They are a trap. Your brain keeps thinking that's where happiness lies. Your brain is lying to you.
So like, it's a, remember that you too will die.
Yeah.
And so therefore don't.
Correct. Live as if your days are finite. Make every moment count, because you don't have so many of them coming. Right. Okay, so then he asks him another, what should a person do to make himself popular? And they give the classic rabbinic answer, hate sovereignty and authority. By the way, this is the moment where you should be thinking, Zionism is in fact a rebellion against rabbinic ethics. Right? I know I'm saying something that got your attention now.
Say it again.
Zionism is a rebellion against rabbinic ethics.
Could you explain?
Yes, I'm about to explain it.
Because rabbinic.
The rabbi's solution to anti-Semitism is to give in to powerlessness. If we just mind our business, go about our prayers, pay attention to Minyan, maybe the Gentiles will leave us alone. You're shaking your head because you're a Zionist. Because you said, you know what? We gave that powerlessness 2,000 years. It didn't turn out so good. So if you don't mind, we're going to hold the other end of the gun for a while. We're going to have the opportunity to screw up just like everybody else who has a country screws up. We're going to exercise power just as badly as everybody else. But if you don't mind, we'd like to be holding the guns for a while. Right? Zionism is a rejection of rabbinic political ethics. And this is the only place where the author of this story allows Alexander to have the last line. Every other time the rabbis insult him, there's silence. But this time, he gets the last word. He says, I have a better answer than you do. Love sovereignty and authority, but use it to confer benefit on mankind. Isn't that interesting? So this means that some guy in the rabbinic shop is being critical of rabbinic political wisdom, right? In the Talmud, he has smuggled a proto-Zionist line, right? The best thing to do is not to abandon power to others. The best thing is to have power, but use it for human benefit, right? What's bad is the abuse of power, not the having of power. Powerlessness is bad. Power badly used is bad, but power used to confer benefit is in fact the right thing. It's the best possible choice. So this is the one place where he lets Alexander have the last line. And then he moves on. Is it better to live on the sea or on dry land? And they say better dry land because those who set out to sea are never free from anxiety. How is that a rebuttal of Alexander the Great? He never stays put. He doesn't live on dry land. You know, there's an old joke about ancient maps that used to call the unknown continents terra firma, right? The more firma, the less terra. Take it for what it is. So then they say, among you, who's the wisest? And they say, we're all equal, because we've all conferred in our answers to you. And now he notices that they've been sticking it to him from the beginning. So he says, why do you resist me? And they answer, Satan is too powerful. What does that mean? So first of all, I want to point out to you, since she's not in the room, my wife, the prosecutor, Hasatan in Hebrew means the prosecutor. It's not a personal name. There's no guy named Satan. Satan is his job. He's the prosecutor. Witnesses, people accused by the court don't like prosecutors, right? Because the prosecutor's job is to point out all the ways you have crossed a line. So prosecutors are never popular. Nobody ever writes my wife a letter after she puts them away for 20 years saying, by the way, you did a marvelous job in getting my conviction. Kudos to you. Right? So Satan has a bad reputation, but Satan is an agent of the court, just like a prosecutor, right? He's the angel whose job is to point out our flaws before God. And there is an angel whose job is to be the defense, that's Michael, right? And you can count on him to make a robust defense as much as is possible. But why are they saying Satan is too powerful rather than what they mean, which is you are too powerful? Why don't they just say that? Because they're being polite. It is a commonplace among rabbinic lashon in the Talmud. They won't insult you directly. They'll put in a phrase, but everybody knows who they're talking about. They're telling you no one should have the amount of power you have, right? Which is an interesting thing in our culture when certain rich people have an enormous amount of power, good or bad. They're saying people shouldn't have that kind of power. Nobody should have that kind of power. And he says, hey, I could kill you. Yeah.
Perhaps they're also saying that if they gave in to resisting, that if they gave in to him and decided that they would not resist, the Satan would have an opportunity to prosecute them in the future.
That may well be. Correct. So then they say, he says, you know, I could kill you guys. You keep insulting me, but I have it in my power. I could have you slaughtered. And they say, power is in the hands of the king, but it doesn't beseem a king to be false. Now this line, what this reminds me of, you may remember when Ronald Reagan was president and he was planning a trip to Germany. And it appeared that on his itinerary was a trip to a cemetery in Bitburg at which were buried SS men. let me use this opportunity to encourage you to turn off your phones. And if you have candy, why don't you unwrap it now? Does anybody in the theater actually unwrap candy at that point, or is that just something they say?
It happened at the theater on that last night.
So when Reagan was going to Bitburg, Elie Wiesel had an appearance in the White House, and on national television, you may remember, he said to him, "Mr. President, that place is not your place." It was a remarkable moment of truth speaking to power. Reagan was the most popular man in Western civilization at the time, and Elie Wiesel had no armies behind him, no power except a moral power. Extraordinary. That's what they're doing with Alexander here. Yeah, you have the power to kill us. That would be a complete betrayal of what you pretend to be, right? And the way you know this is a fiction is that having insulted him all this way, he clothes them in garments of purple and puts chains of gold around their necks. That is not how Alexander treated people who insulted him. But now the story gets interesting, and this was just the prelude. So notice, where do we stand? The guys who are anonymous and who are rooted in a place versus the guy who is named, famous, and has no roots. They've been telling him, you have wasted your life, right? All this seeking power and glory somewhere else is going to leave you just as empty at the end as it was at the beginning. You should not be going chasing that kind of hole in your heart. So he now shifts the subject. Okay, I can't have a conversation with you guys, at least give me directions. I want to go to Africa. And I'll just point out for those of you who are big fans, if you look in the beginning of this paragraph, right before the exclamation point, the ancient Aramaic word to say Africa is Afrique, which is actually Africa. So he wants to go to Africa. Now I need to say a word about Africa in the rabbinic imagination. The rabbis don't know sub-Saharan Africa. So they imagine a place with no culture, no tradition. This is not true. Any of you who have been to sub-Saharan Africa know there are rich traditions and culture, but Western people were ignorant of them and assumed that they didn't have it. So Alexander, the world's most famous Gentile, wants to go to Africa, and because the rabbis are Jewish, they worry he's going to hurt himself. So instead of telling you how to get there, they say you really can't because the mountains are in the way. I love this. It's like they practically say bubala. Right? And he, being both a king and a Greek, he's not used to people worrying about him skinning his knee or something, right? And so he says to them, hey, that's not what I asked you. I asked you how to get there. So then they say, all right, take Libyan donkeys that can travel in the dark, because they assume it's always dark in Africa, and take coils of rope and fix them as you go by the side of the road so that when you decide to come home, you can just find your way back using the rope. Anyone know where that story comes from? You've heard a similar story. Where? The Minotaur. This is a Greek myth. This is Daedalus and the Minotaur, right? So the rabbis know Greek mythology. They are aware of Greek culture, right? They may not have read Greek literature, but the stories are out there. So they borrow from them, and here's one of the borrows. Okay? So he did that, and he sets forth. And now here's where the story gets really juicy. He comes to a place where there are only women. You understand that for Alexander, that's of limited use to him. Right? So for most men in history, there are largely three things women are useful for. Have children, and cook, and there's one other thing. Well, you guys are so decorous. I assume even in New Jersey, people know about sex, right? We did not invent it in California, we just perfected it. Right? So So Alexander is famously and notoriously not interested in women for sex. So the other things he thinks of is, okay, let's have a war. Because that's something he's good at. And so he says to them, let's go to war. And they say, nothing doing. There's no way we're gonna fight you because it will end badly for you no matter what the outcome is. Either you'll be the guy who fought a bunch of women, that doesn't make you look good. Or you're the guy who lost to a bunch of women, that doesn't make you look good either. So we're not doing it, right? So now he's frustrated and he's going to think of one other thing for the women to do. So he says, okay, feed me, right? And here comes the wisdom. They bring him gold bread on a gold table. And he says, are you kidding? You think people can eat gold? Now, why are they doing that? Why are they bringing him a gold table with gold bread when he asks for a meal?
Because you can't eat that.
Because you can't eat it, right? And what they say to him is, didn't they have bread in the place you came from? So I want to highlight, I think, the genius of the anonymous guy who wrote this story. Men often teach by preaching. Women often teach by doing, right? The women don't preach because preaching, I will tell you from a lifetime of it, is very ineffective. You need to let people learn from their experiences. So they bring him this fancy gold bread and he has to say, ugh, I'm still hungry. That's not working. And they say, yeah, that's right. So the more you are out in the road looking for gold, the more you're still gonna hunger. Go home. And Alexander learns from that. When he left the place, he wrote on the gate of the city, I, Alexander of Macedon, was a fool until I came to the city of women in Africa and I learned wisdom from the women. This is in the Talmud. Right? This is amazing. Now I want to highlight it to you. I want to make this explicit. The most famous Gentile in the world, named, powerful, man of legend. In rabbinic imagination, the least significant people in the world. These are Black, African, nameless women. And who has the wisdom? They do. They do. Now, here's the other question I want to ask you. This is a story being told to rabbinical students. Why did they need to hear this story? Yep, he says, still wounded from all those years ago. Why did they need to hear this?
Because you can learn things from women.
Okay, so one is, you can learn things from women, yes. Also, yeah, yes.
I don't think it's just women, I think women serve as an example of anyone, that you can learn from anyone. In your speech the other night about how you can learn from anyone, that's really what this is.
Correct, so wisdom doesn't come in the wrapping you expect. And one of the ways we blind ourselves to the teachers in our life is if they don't look like what we're looking for, we don't hear them. So this is a story about attend to wisdom from the ones you don't think have it. Because they have exactly the message you need, right? Yeah.
And you could learn wisdom from mistakes and failures. That's a good teacher.
For sure, you can learn from mistakes and failures, right? So notice though, yeah,
And also to strengthen what we read at the beginning, that what it means to be a rich man, not necessarily the goal, but
exactly right. So the women are teaching him, you know what wealth is? Wealth is people who love you. When I and my daughter went to Uganda for Rabbi Gershom's installation, I saw a community of people who were poor in material ways, but I've never been to a community where people cared about each other more, right? The generosity of that community was extraordinary, right? Is extraordinary. And that's what they're teaching him. And for a minute, he gets it. But here's the two things I want to point out. First of all, you know this is a Jewish story because it involves a plaque. A plaque. He puts up a plaque. Do I need to clarify the concept? Rabbi, do you not have plaques at the synagogue? Oh, yeah. Let me tell you, ask anybody who's given a plaque and they can explain what a plaque is. Right? So Alexander puts up a plaque. By the way, plaques are very ancient in our tradition. We have synagogues from the year 200 in the land of Israel. They have plaques from the people who donated the building. Right? And I will point out one other thing. Several of the plaques are from the people who claim to be president of the congregation, the Nasi of the Beit Midrash. Rabbis were not in the Beit Midrash, in the Beit Knesset, they were in the study hall. The people who gave the money to pay for that synagogue building are often women. So here's an interesting tidbit about Jewish history. There is no evidence for separate seating for men and women until after the rise of Islam. He says, it took me a whole weekend to get. There was no separation of men and women until the Muslims instituted it. And then we couldn't let them be more frum than us. But it is literally tat hagoyim. It is literally taking the practice of the Gentiles and bringing it into the synagogue, which I would argue is asur. It is forbidden, right? Jewish men and women worshipped together. How do we know this? Because in none of the ancient synagogues is there an Ezrat Nashim, not one of them. And you might want to assume, well, that's because the women stayed home, except one of them was president of the shul and paid for the building. And it is very unlikely that she did not take her seat in the front by the eastern wall. Yes.
But the Ezra Nashim in the Beit Mikdash.
So interesting, the Ezra Nashim, I'll translate that question, good question. So in the temple, there is a courtyard called Ezra Nashim. Who worshipped in the Ezra Nashim?
Everyone.
Everyone.
But then only the men were allowed forward.
Which men?
I don't know, I'm asking.
You actually do know who gets to go into the inner courtyard. Kohanim. So if you are Yisrael and you are a man, where do you worship from? Ezra Nashim.
So why was it called the Love Machine?
So all the great questions. So well then, if men and women are worshiping there, why do they call it Ezra Nashim? No, because you name the place for what's unusual. When you name a road in North America, you don't name it for the city it starts in, you name it for the city that you're going to. Right? So roads get named by their destination. What's unusual is that this is the place where men and women can worship in, but it's not a big deal that men worship. So what's striking is that it's even the women can worship here.
So it is striking that even the women are involved.
Yes, of course it's striking. It's a big deal. One of the things that is precious about ancient Israel is the women worship. That's amazing, right?
All of, you're saying all of the region is.
All of it. So okay, we're gonna get a little far afield. Take a look at Nehemiah 8 when you get a chance, right? For our Christian friends, it's Nehemiah 8. Right, Nehemiah 8 is the first Rosh Hashanah back in the land of Israel. And he takes a book, the Sefer Torah. Up till then, it wasn't a book. Up until then, it was a collection of legends and stories and instructions. He writes a scroll out. That's what we did when we were in Persia in exile. He sets up a big bima. They get up on the middle of the bima and he reads it to the whole people. And it says 3 times in that story, he reads it to the men, the women, the children, and all who can listen, which makes me wonder, who is he talking about? I mean, who else isn't included in men, women, children? Maybe intersex people, maybe trans people, I don't know, but it's really interesting. There's some other 3rd, 4th group. But But his reading of the Torah is everyone's together. There's no assumption in Nehemiah that the men and the women have to separate. And they don't separate. They all hear it together. So I just want 1 second, Rabbi, right? So the normative practice of ancient Israel was men and women together. I am not claiming that Judaism wasn't a patriarchal religion. That's not the claim. It's a more limited claim. We worship together. And the idea of separate seating is a Goyish idea, and I think not a good one.
Except when we got the Torah.
Well, correct. When we got the Torah, the men were told to separate from their wives for reasons of Tuma. Correct,
But it's not that they were standing separate.
correct. Yes,
I'm still trying to come to terms with the last sentence until I came to the city of women about council.
Yeah.
Louder.
I'll repeat it.
Okay, and your response is, well, let's look for wisdom from where we don't expect it. Could it just be that there was one rabbinic authority in the Talmud that actually was a little more receptive of the idea that women have intelligence than some of the horrible things that I've read as well? I mean,
Yes.
can they be reconciled?
So the question is, could it be that there's someone who's writing the story who's more open to the idea of women being wise than some of the more misanthropic things that are in the Talmud? And here I just want to remind you, the Talmud admits that it is the weaving together of multiple voices. And they don't all agree with each other. So there are rabbis who apparently had their daughters putting on tefillin in the Talmud, and there are rabbis who say it's a disgrace. Don't flatten the Torah into an anonymous book of one opinion. The Torah has multiple opinions, which also, by the way, means that Jewish legal tradition generally has more options than its current defenders will admit, right? So Rashi put tefillin and tzitzit on his daughters because they were Jews, right? Rabban Gamliel let his slave, who was a Gentile, put on tefillin, right? There's lots of diverse practice for us to reach back to and reclaim, right? So the fact that the dominant voice out of medieval Jewry aped the Gentiles, right? We acted like the Catholic Church and the imams. But that doesn't mean we can't, now that we're back in our own land, reclaim a more authentic pluralism. We can, and we should. Okay, may I continue? So notice now the same lesson has been taught twice. First, the sages of the Negev trying to teach him that you're on the wrong path. Then the women warriors of Africa taught him a little more successfully. But here's the thing about life's big lessons. They never are learned just once. You have to learn them and then learn them and then learn them again and again and again. The human capacity to fall back on habit is devastating. So Alex wanders off with his new insight. He even put up a sign and forgets it. So he's journeying all his way home and he sits by a well and he starts to eat. And he had taken salted fish with him. That also makes it sound like a very Jewish story to me. I counted 5 different kinds of fish here, right? I want you to note that if you eat at least 3, then it's a complete fish. So he washes them in the water and they lose their saltiness. They become sweet. So he realizes this is not normal water. This is special water. And he realizes that this shows that it comes from the Garden of Eden. So those of you who are careful readers of the Bible, you remember that there are 4 streams that start inside the Garden of Eden and flow out. He has found one of them in Africa, right? And so smart guy that he is, he says, I think I'm gonna go retrace this so that I can take a tour of the Garden of Eden. Right? And so he wanders along until he gets to a gate. And it's the door to the Garden of Eden. And he says, Pitchu li, open the gate, right? And what do they say back? Zeh hashar l'Adonai. Now, here's what I need to tell you about rabbinic use of Bible. They will often quote the first part of the line when what they mean is the second part. So how does that line finish? Zeh hashar l'Adonai, this is the gate of God. Tzadikim yavo uvo, which means only the righteous can enter. He's getting burned again, right? And we have no idea who's burning him. Is this some sages in the Garden of Eden? Is this angels in the Garden of Eden? Is this that twirling sword? Is this God? No idea. But the anonymous cosmic voice is saying, buddy, you are not coming in. And he gets really frustrated. He says, I'm a king. You can kind of imagine him stomping the ground. He's sort of like a 3-year-old kid. Right? I'm a king and I matter, so at least if you're not going to let me in, give me something. So the weirdest gift of all time, they give him an eyeball. And he's puzzled by this. What could this be about? So he takes the eyeball and he puts it on a scale, and on the other scale, he puts all of his wealth. And which one is heavier?
The eyeball.
The eyeball. This is a common Middle Eastern story, right? The human eye is never satisfied. Never. Everybody wants a bigger apartment, a newer car, and a spiffier partner. Everybody. And there's no end to it. Right? If you keep thinking the next thing you buy will make you happy, you will never stop buying things and you will never be happy. So this turns out is the same lesson he's been taught twice already. And how does he learn this? He went and weighs it and nothing equaled the eyeball. So he says to the rabbis who suddenly appear magically stage left, right? Suddenly there's a bunch of rabbis when you least want them. How is this possible? And they say it's an eyeball of a human which is never satisfied. And he said to them, can you prove that? So they took a little dust and they cover the eyeball. And the minute the eyeball is covered, the gold and silver comes crashing to the ground. And so it is written, the netherworld and destruction are never satisfied, and so the eyes of man are never satisfied. And thus endeth the story. So I love this story, right? 3 times Alexander has to be taught the exact same lesson. And now I want to bring it home. This story isn't teaching him, it's teaching us. What is it we need to know from this story?
Retail therapy doesn't work.
There you go. Retail therapy, buying stuff doesn't work, right? What are we to learn from this? The only thing that matters is relationship, the people you love and the love you share. That is the only source of actual happiness. The rest is ephemeral and will betray you. So, if you enter your profession for ego advancement, put it away. No one's going to remember you no matter what, right? I have this conversation with rabbis often. What is your legacy, they say. And I say, here's the news. No one's going to remember us. Your legacy doesn't exist, except the people whose lives you've touched. And that will ripple on anonymously to the end of time. But you won't get the credit, right? That, by the way, is also true for your professional achievements. When I first started at the university, the then president of the university, David Lieber, who was a real tzaddik, said to me, Brad, you can accomplish anything so long as you don't care who gets the credit. Wiser words never spoken. That's 1 second. That's the lesson of this story. Don't put your happiness in conquering new worlds. Don't put your happiness in how famous you are, how many likes you get, or how many clicks you get, or how many whatever you sell. In the long run, the cemeteries are filled with famous people that no one remembers. And if that's where you bank your happiness, you will die alone and miserable. But if you can be like the women warriors of Africa, if you can derive your happiness like the rabbis of the Negev from being part of a collective enterprise that will outlive all of us, and in its thriving, there's a piece of you that remains alive, then there is real contentment to be gained. That's what I wanted to bring to you. Thank you for the chance to look at.
Joe? We're gonna first get people down to the podium. Joe. Then
Well, first I would say people do remember Alexander the Great. But also, he's an interesting foil, I think, because historically he was viewed very positively by Jews. When he went through Judea, he was very solicitous for the high priest. He allowed them to keep all their customs and, not the tax. But, he was certainly better to Jews than many other conquerors who came through. It's how do we, and so this is, I don't know, 800 years maybe after Alexander lived in Babylonia. How are the rabbis thinking of a historical Alexander? As you say, they're using him to make fun of him, or as a foil?
They are certainly using him
like
as a.
FDR, who's also viewed very positively by Jews. How is the historical Alexander thinking?
Great.
of the rabbi?
So you may know better than I. To my knowledge, there is no contemporaneous evidence of Alexander in the Holy Land. Right? We assume he was in the general region. We have evidence of his having been in India. But there are only legends about him. And the thing is, I'm a little skeptical because every local culture had an Alexander gets bested by our sages story. So I don't know that Alexander was actually in Jerusalem. I don't know that he was actually a better conqueror than some other conqueror. That, by the way, is a weird category. But I do know that Alexander loomed large in the imagination. I also want to say that Alexander, like Napoleon, like FDR, has a very good reputation that hasn't done well over time. So I think the days that Jews have FDR's picture up in the living room are long gone. We just know too much at this point. I don't want to spoil the ending of the story, but that whole Napoleon Bonaparte thing ended badly. The ode to joy was joy that he got defeated. It is true that he was great for the Jews. He emancipated Jews everywhere his armies went, so we loved him. He also wanted to mandate the permissibility of intermarriage, which was dicey for the French Jews, but they've been living on the cutting edge for a long time there. But this is purely the fictional Alexander. Right, this has nothing to do with the historical character. Yeah.
This is true today. It sounds like what you said, but was this not true, say, 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 150 years ago, when our grandparents and great-grandparents put up with an awful lot, looked at their lives to get us to today?
For sure. Look, we stand on the shoulders of people who by and large were not famous and didn't seek fame. What they sought was to make things better for their children and their children's children. If you'll indulge me a story, several years ago, I had the honor of being the person to do the benediction at a White House Hanukkah party. So me and Michelle Obama and her husband, what's his face? You know, and when it was over, I went up to a woman who was one of the wait people there, and I said, I need to talk to someone, can I talk to you? And she said, sure. And I said, I don't know how you work here all the time. Like I'm just thinking of my grandmother who came over as a 9-year-old girl on a boat. And if you told her that her grandson was going to be the rabbi giving the benediction in the White House and then talking to the president of the United States, who was African American, there's nothing in that sentence that would have sounded vaguely realistic to her. It would have sounded messianic, right? And she said, I feel that every day working here, right? So, you know, I think for me, my unshakable love for this country, despite its considerable flaws, is that this place has been so good to my family and my people and to so many people, despite its real problems, that, you know, I'm a team player forever, right? And that is what this story is highlighting. And it's not just about Alexander, right? Obviously, the point of the story is you want those arrogant young rabbinical students. I hope I'm not revealing something out of court when I say that some rabbinical students are motivated by ego a little bit. That this is a corrective to them, right? Don't study Talmud for that. This isn't gonna, if this is about your personal greatness, you're gonna be miserable and you're gonna hurt a lot of people. Right? So don't do it. Yeah.
I would say, from a personal experience, a little bit about the arrogant inexperience of Alexander the Great. I lived in Italy as a medical student. I went to the public market. There was a kosher fish called cod. It was salted. I didn't know how to cook it. I brought it home. I put it with some oil and tried cooking without soaking it. It was disgusting, like a piece of salty leather. And then the lady next door said, dummy, you gotta put it in water to take the salt out. And then it was a delicious piece of fish. Miraculously, it didn't need a refrigerator. That was great every time when you cooked it. And that was something Alexander never prepared his food. And he made a big Megillah about it and looked for the Garden of Eden. So it's just, you know, example of, you know, I was very humbled by that experience.
Great, so that is, one possibility is that Alexander made a big deal out of it. The other is that the water coming out of your tap was from the Garden of Eden. We'll never know, will we?
Ask you about your comment before that if you look for justification of practical Zionism in the Talmud, you won't find it. But do you think you find to the spiritual, what we call like spiritual Zionism, or not at all?
Okay, so let me clarify. The original Zionists were secular Jews who saw religion as their enemy. And the Orthodox Jews of their time prohibited making Aliyah because the Talmud prohibits organized move to the land of Israel. You're supposed to wait for Mashiach. And Zionism is the rejection of that. But I want to be clear, I'm not saying that Zionism cannot be made compatible, even indispensable, to Jewish life. What is true is that the entire Tanakh and the entire rabbinic enterprise is full of Ahavat Zion, the love of Zion. And the ideal that is posited in the Talmud, in the Bible, in the Mishnah, is of the Jewish people exercising sovereignty in our own land. So in that degree, Zionism is a fulfillment of deep, deep things in the Siddur and throughout Jewish literature. I'm not claiming otherwise. To the extent that Zionism is a 19th century nationalist movement, It's a new way of organizing ancient Jewish values. And it is true, there was no nationalist movement prior to the 19th century when the Italians were doing it, the Germans were doing it. Like it's obviously, it was in the air and we got the same bug as they did. I think it is a reasonable thing to say that in the modern world, nationalism is one of the indispensable ways of defending one's people's existence. So I am a Zionist. I also just want to note that there are things that Zionists taught and thought that were a rejection of Judaism. In much the same way that the Bundists, who are your ancestors, when they got on the boat and left Poland, they took their tefillin and their wigs and they threw them into the water. There are fish in the Atlantic who are carrying shidels and tefillin and wondering why they started bubbling in Yiddish. Because when they came to America, it wasn't because they wanted to reestablish religious Jewish orthodoxy. They wanted to get away from it. And their rabbis had told them it's forbidden to go to America because it's a treifa Medina, right? So we tend to ignore that. And I think that does a disservice. Your ancestors, if I may be so bold, because it's mine too, were the ignorant and unlearned ones of our people, right? The ones with educations and who were observant, they stayed and got murdered, right? So I thank God for my ill-educated ancestors who had the vision and the courage to say, we need to get out of here, right? They made our lives possible, and I am every day grateful to them for what they did. In the same way, Zionism was both a fulfillment of things within Jewish heritage and a rejection of things within Jewish heritage. By the way, one last comment, it's one of the things that makes it so obscene the way the Haredi world takes advantage of Zionism, right? It is such a profound contradiction in so many ways. And my hope is that there is soon peace in the land of Israel. And my prediction is that as soon as there is, the secular Israelis are going to have to turn to this issue, which they don't have the luxury of dealing with at the moment, but they will. Okay, let's start with people who haven't yet raised their hands, if we could, and
Yes, we talked about acceptance, learning from people we expect we might learn from, the importance of relationships and inclusiveness, I expect. So I have always had a problem, and separate seating in the very orthodox part of Judaism. So how can we work toward acceptance by the Orthodox of the other groups under the umbrella of Jews?
how can we work
Does
for,
the Talmud give us any guidance?
how can we work for acceptance among the Orthodox for Jewish pluralism and diversity? I have a complicated answer to that. You cannot beg people who don't see you to see you. And the more energy you expend being accepted by people who denigrate you, the more you contribute to your own belittling. So what we can do is create wonderful Jewish communities like this one. And we can share how wonderful it is with the people who are open to hearing it. And there are some people within Orthodoxy who are willing to admit that conservative and Reform Judaism have a useful role for Am Yisrael, even if they don't think our interpretations are legitimate. That, by the way, is all I'm looking for. I don't think their interpretations are legitimate. So I don't need them to vindicate me, I just need them to be civil. Right, so that's all we should be looking for. But here's the thing, the Jews are not, as I said yesterday, a religion, we are a people. And people are diverse. There are Americans with whom you share some political views and Americans with whom you vehemently disagree about America. You can both love America, you can both live together. I think we have to do that with the Jewish people in all of its diversity too. You can't just love Jews in the abstract. You have to love actual Jews, which includes a lot of obnoxious people.
I'd just like to reinforce the idea of the gold and the eyeball. The story about a man is dying, his family is around him. And he lifts up his head and he says, I should have bought more crap. And that, you know, we all have stuff, we're downsizing. It's
Yeah.
incredible the crap we have, or I have.
Yeah, not me. I love all my stuff.